It was a warm evening in Lagos, and we were all at the dinner table. The smell of stew filled the room, and for a moment everything felt normal. Then my mom looked straight at me and said, "You're nothing but a parasite." Her words cut so deep I couldn't even breathe. I froze with my spoon in midair, staring at her in shock. My younger sister Adiz, who was heavily pregnant and glowing with pride, smirked like she had been waiting for that exact moment. My chest tightened as I tried to process what I had just heard. How could she say that to me, after all I had done? I thought about the bills I paid, the groceries I bought, and the nights I stayed up late helping out whenever they needed me. I had sacrificed so much for this family, yet in one sentence, my mother made me feel like I was worthless. I glanced at Adiz, and her satisfied smile told me everything. This wasn't a slip of the tongue, it was an attack I was never supposed to recover from. The room suddenly felt smaller, the laughter from earlier gone, replaced with an icy silence that pressed down on me. My hands trembled as I lowered the spoon back into my bowl, pretending to eat while my heart shattered inside me. At that moment, I realized something important. No matter how much I gave, in their eyes, I would never be enough. A week later, I came home from work tired but relieved to finally rest in my own space. I turned the key, pushed the door open, and froze. My living room was full of boxes. Adiz and her husband were laughing and unpacking like they owned the place. My heart started racing. "What's going on here?" I asked, trying to stay calm though my voice shook. Before they could even answer, my mom walked out of the kitchen with a big smile. "We gave her your apartment," she announced proudly, like she had done something noble. "She needs it more than you." For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. My apartment? The one I worked day and night to pay for. The place I had carefully saved every naira to furnish, painting the walls with my own hands, picking out every chair, every curtain, every little thing. I felt my legs weaken. "You gave my apartment?" I whispered. But she just nodded, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Adiz rubbed her round belly and looked at me with that same smug smile from the dinner table. "Family comes first," she said softly, but her tone was sharp, almost mocking. My chest burned as anger and disbelief mixed together. I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind them of every sacrifice I had made. I wanted to tell my mother that she had no right, that this apartment was mine, that it was my safe place after years of struggle. But when I opened my mouth, no words came out. Instead, I stood there watching my sanctuary turn into someone else's home. My sister's clothes were already hanging on the line, her husband's shoes lined neatly by the door. My own things were pushed aside like they were in the way, like I no longer belonged there. My mother moved around cheerfully, explaining how it was only fair because Adiz was starting a family and I was still young and independent. Every word felt like another slap in the face. I swallowed hard, forcing myself not to break down in front of them. I realized in that moment that nothing I had done mattered. My years of struggle, my sleepless nights, my careful savings, it could all be erased in a second, just because my mother decided so. They didn't ask. They didn't consider. They didn't care. That night, as I sat quietly in a corner of the apartment that was no longer mine, I felt invisible. Adiz laughed with her husband, my mom beamed with pride, and I sat there feeling like a stranger in my own house. But deep inside, something shifted. I understood clearly that if I wanted to build a life of my own, I could no longer rely on this family. They had shown me exactly where I stood. My heart ached, but a new kind of fire started burning inside me, the kind that comes when you realize you have no one to depend on but yourself. That night, I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the walls that no longer felt like mine. The laughter from the living room echoed through the apartment, Adiz and her husband arranging things like they had always lived there. My mother's voice floated in too, proud and satisfied, and I realized there was no space for me anymore. I could have screamed. I could have fought. I could have reminded them of every bill I paid, every sacrifice I made, every tear I had swallowed just to keep this place standing. But I didn't. Something inside me had gone quiet. Not weak, not defeated, just quiet in a way that carried more strength than shouting ever could. I opened my closet and pulled out a small travel bag. One by one, I folded the clothes I truly needed. Not everything, just enough to start again. As I packed, I felt lighter, as though with every shirt and pair of jeans I tucked inside, I was also packing away years of hurt and disappointment. My hands trembled, but not from fear. It was a new kind of energy, one I hadn't felt before, like a fire slowly waking up in my chest. When the bag was ready, I walked to the kitchen counter and set my keys down. The sound of metal hitting wood was louder than all the voices in the other room. That was the sound of goodbye, though none of them noticed. They were too busy celebrating what they thought was a victory. I slipped out quietly, closing the door behind me. The night air hit my face, cool and sharp, and I took the deepest breath I had taken in months. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying their expectations, their insults, or their control. I was just carrying myself. They thought I would crawl back one day, begging for forgiveness, desperate to be welcomed home again. But as I walked down that street with my small bag, I knew I would never return the same way. Every step away from that apartment felt like a step toward something greater, though I had no idea what it was yet. My heart was heavy, yes, but it was also awake. Betrayal has a way of breaking you or building you, and I knew deep inside that this one had lit a fire I didn't even know I carried. That night I had no clear plan, no big promise, no money saved up to fall back on. But I had my strength, and I had silence. And in that silence, I found the courage to walk away from everything that tried to bury me. They thought they had taken everything from me, but what they really gave me was the push I needed to finally begin. When I left that night, I had no plan, only a small bag and the weight of betrayal sitting heavy in my chest. I got on a bus to Port Harcourt with more hope than money, but deep inside, I promised myself one thing: I would never go back to being the person they thought I was. The days that followed were hard. I worked any job I could find. In the mornings, I took shifts at a small restaurant, washing dishes and serving tables. In the evenings, I helped at a fuel station, standing on my feet until my legs ached. Some nights, I barely had enough energy to eat before falling asleep on a thin mattress in a tiny room I rented. But I never complained. Every hour I worked, every naira I saved, felt like a brick I was laying for the future I was secretly building. I stopped calling home. I didn't explain where I was or how I was surviving. At first, my phone buzzed with messages, but I ignored them until they stopped coming. It was better that way. Silence became my shield. Nobody knew what I was doing, and that gave me strength. They thought I had disappeared, maybe even failed, but I was working quietly, planning every step with care. I lived on the bare minimum. I cut out every luxury. No new clothes, no parties, no unnecessary spending. Every naira went straight into my savings. It wasn't easy, but I had a vision that was bigger than comfort. Slowly, I began learning about business. I read books borrowed from friends, I listened to people who were smarter than me, and I asked questions even when it made me look foolish. Little by little, the pieces started to come together. One evening, after months of saving, I looked at my small notebook where I kept track of every coin. The numbers weren't big, but they were enough to take the first step. I invested in a small venture, selling everyday essentials. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I poured my energy into it, waking up before dawn, chasing suppliers, bargaining with customers, keeping records late into the night. Every sale, no matter how small, pushed me closer to freedom. There were setbacks, of course. Times when I thought it would all collapse. Days when I felt the sting of rejection or the weight of exhaustion. But each time I wanted to quit, I remembered the night I walked out of that apartment. I remembered the smirk on Adi's face, the coldness in my mother's voice. And I told myself, This pain must produce something. Months passed, and my small business began to grow. It was not yet an empire, but it was a seed taking root. And all of it was happening in silence, away from their eyes, away from their control. They thought I was broken. They thought I was gone. But in reality, I was building. Piece by piece, day by day, I was creating the life that would one day shock them all. 9 months passed like a blur. While my family thought I had vanished into thin air, I was in Port Harcourt building myself from the ground up. The long days, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices, they had all led to this moment. When Adi's baby shower came up in Abuja, I knew I had to go. Everyone expected me to arrive quietly, probably looking worn out, maybe even ashamed, with nothing to my name. That was the picture they painted of me, the parasite, who had been thrown out with nothing. But this time, I walked in with my head high and my step steady, holding a thick brown envelope close to my chest. The hall was decorated beautifully, filled with laughter, balloons, and music. My relatives turned to look at me as I entered. Some gave polite smiles, others whispered to each other, probably wondering what excuse I had come with. Adiz was glowing in her gown, sitting like a queen while people surrounded her with gifts. My mother stood proudly by her side, smiling wide, certain that this day would belong only to her favorite daughter. I could almost hear their thoughts, she will come with nothing. She will come looking broken. I greeted everyone calmly and took my seat. For a while, I just watched, letting them enjoy their moment. Then, when it was time for people to present their gifts, I stood up slowly. The room grew quieter. I walked to the front where Adiz sat, and I placed the envelope on the table. Everyone's eyes followed my hands as I pushed it toward her. My mother frowned, suspicious, while Adiz smirked as if she expected some small, embarrassing contribution. But when the papers slid out, the room froze. It wasn't baby clothes. It wasn't money tucked in an envelope. It was property documents, legal papers for a brand new duplex in Port Harcourt. Paid in full, under my name. For a moment, silence filled the hall so strongly you could hear the music stop in the background. My mother's eyes widened like she had just seen a ghost. Adiz's smile cracked, her lips trembling as she stared at the bold letters on the documents. Her husband leaned forward, muttering, You bought this?" His voice shook with disbelief. I simply nodded, calm and steady. "Yes. I built this for myself. From nothing." Then I looked straight at my mother, meeting her shocked eyes, and added softly but firmly, "Parasites don't build duplexes." Gasps filled the room. Some relatives clapped in surprise, others sat in stunned silence. My mother opened her mouth to speak but no words came out. Adiz looked down, unable to hold my gaze. In that moment, I didn't feel anger or pride, I just felt free. Everything I had gone through had led to this one point, and I knew they would never see me the same way again. The moment the documents touched the table, the atmosphere in the room changed. Laughter stopped mid-air, chatter turned into silence, and every eye turned to the envelope lying between us. My mother's smile froze before slowly melting into shock. Her eyes widened, darting from the papers to my face as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Adiz, who had been glowing like the star of the evening, suddenly looked as if the ground had shifted beneath her. The fake smile she had worn so confidently began to tremble at the corners of her mouth. Her hand, which had been resting proudly on her belly, tightened as though holding on to something slipping away. Her husband leaned forward, picked up the documents with shaky fingers, and muttered, almost choking on his own words, You bought this?" I stood there calmly, not rushing, not boasting, just letting the truth settle in. I nodded once, firm and sure, before speaking the words that had been burning in me for months. "Parasites don't build empires." The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever felt. Some people gasped, others stared at me like they were seeing me for the first time. My heart was steady. For once, I wasn't defending myself. I wasn't explaining or begging. I was simply standing in the power of what I had built. My mother opened her mouth to say something, but no sound came out. She looked trapped between pride and shame, torn apart by the fact that the child she had once dismissed had just proven her wrong in front of everyone. Adi's husband lowered the papers back onto the table as if they burned his hands, his face pale and unsure. Adi's herself couldn't even look at me. Her confidence, her smugness, her little smirks, all of it vanished in seconds. Whispers began to spread across the hall. Relatives leaned toward each other, murmuring about how I had managed it, about how I had gone from being called a parasite to owning a duplex. Some even clapped quietly, nodding their heads with respect. Others simply stared, processing the shockwave that had just hit the room. I didn't need applause. I didn't need their approval. All I wanted was to show them that the person they had thrown aside, the one they thought would crawl back broken, had risen higher than they could ever imagine. And in that moment, I knew the message had been delivered louder than any argument I could have made. I stood tall, smiled faintly, and let the silence speak for me. Because sometimes, the loudest sound in the world is the shock that comes when people realize you are not who they thought you were, you are stronger. And that night, they all learned it the hard way. The silence in the hall dragged on until my mother finally found her voice. She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes and said, "I only did what any mother would do." Adiz was in her time of need. I had to help her. Her words were smooth, but I could hear the cracks beneath them. She was trying to cover up, to make it sound like her betrayal was an act of love. But the truth hung heavy in the air, and everyone could feel it. She hadn't just helped Adiz, she had dismissed me, brushed aside my sacrifices, and chosen who mattered most in her heart. I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't scared to speak. My voice was steady, my chest didn't tighten, and my hands didn't shake. I said, "No, Mom. You didn't just give away my apartment. You gave away your place in my future." The words left my mouth with a calmness that shocked even me. It wasn't anger or spite, it was the truth, and the truth is heavier than shouting. The room stayed quiet, every relative hanging on to my words, watching the way my mother's face fell. Her eyes darted from me to the documents on the table, then back again. For a moment, she looked smaller, almost guilty, but she quickly straightened her back. "I thought you would understand. Family comes first," she said weakly, repeating Adiz's old line as if it could erase everything. But the damage was already done. The people in the room had seen what she did, they had seen how far I had come despite her rejection, and they could see clearly now who was wrong. Adiz shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her glow from earlier completely gone. She wouldn't meet my eyes, and her husband stayed quiet, staring down at the floor. No one came to defend my mother's excuse. No one tried to challenge my words. It was as if the entire family was waking up in that moment, realizing the depth of what had been done to me. I stood tall, not raising my voice, not adding anything more. Sometimes, one sentence is enough to cut through years of lies. And that sentence, those words, were the boundary I had needed all my life. It wasn't about revenge, it wasn't about making them feel small. It was about finally choosing myself and letting them know that the door to my heart and my future wasn't wide open anymore. My mother looked at me, and for the first time, I think she realized she had lost something she couldn't get back. Not my apartment, not my savings, not my property, but me. And as the room stayed quiet, I felt lighter. I had said what needed to be said, and there was no turning back. That night, after everything had unfolded, I didn't linger in the hall. I wasn't there to prove any more points or to bask in their shock. I simply reached into my bag, pulled out a small wrapped gift, and placed it gently in Adiz's hands. "Congratulations," I said sincerely, my voice calm and steady. She looked at me with wide eyes, unsure of how to respond, but I didn't wait. I turned, smiled faintly at a few relatives who were still whispering, and walked out. The cool Abuja night met me at the door, and with every step away from that hall, I felt lighter. My phone buzzed non-stop for days afterward, calls, messages, relatives trying to reach me, my mother sending long explanations, Adiz typing short apologies. I read some, ignored most. I had no bitterness left in me, only clarity. They weren't my enemies, but I finally understood they weren't the foundation I needed to lean on either. Back in Port Harcourt, I sat on the balcony of my new duplex, the keys resting warm in my palm. I thought about the journey, the insults, the betrayal, the nights I almost gave up. And then I looked at the solid walls around me, walls I had built with my own sweat, my own sacrifice. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. I closed my hand around the keys and whispered to myself, never again. Never again would I let anyone reduce me, control me, or call me a parasite. Because now, I had proven, not to them, but to myself, that I was far more than they ever believed.